Hello and welcome. This is a lecture review for the William Stallings Effective Cybersecurity First Edition book. Again, this is a lecture review using the material offered by the publisher Pearson VUE. All copyrights belong to them. This is for educational purposes only. Again, the textbook is Stallings Effective Cybersecurity, a guide to using best practices and standards, first edition, done through Pearson VUE Education, ISBN number 13 97801 3477 2806. So again, copyright belongs to the author and publisher. I am just doing lecture reviews on the PowerPoints for each of the individual chapters. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. Chapter 12 is about networking and communication. This chapter provides a survey of security and management issues related to broad and related areas of networking and electronic communication, typically referred to as data or digital communications. This chapter begins with an overview of network management concepts. Following this section, we'll cover firewalls, VPNs. This will give us the background. And then we'll get later into addressing specific security concerns involved with network management. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. So again, some brief functional areas of management based off of common ITU or ISO based standards. These are 5 of the main areas. Fault management, account management, configuration management, and performance management. Lastly, security management. These are all key areas that oftentimes we like to just ignore. Fault management is basically the facility that enables the detection, isolation, and correction of odd behavior. If we find a fault, are we able to handle the situation? Account management will be the ability to facilitate and enable charges to establish the use of managed objects, including costs, throughout the organization. Basically, we're able to identify the use of objects and their costs. For example, let's say I buy a server. Well, who's using that server? What systems are using that server? What departments are using that server? Can I now take billable time based off of the different departments off of that server? Hey, maybe account HR is using 5% of those resources. Maybe accounting is using 20% of their resources. Maybe general office using 10% of those resources. We can now allocate the cost of that server to those different departments to ensure that we can keep buying hardware assets. Configuration management is, again, dealing with the configuration. It facilitates the ability to exercise control over, identify, collect data from and to, as well as provide data to manage objects for the operation of interconnected services. This also deals very specifically with the configuration of those objects and services. Essentially, if we want to do maintenance, can we do that? Who is needing to be involved? what maintenance is needing to be involved. How can we ensure that all of the stakeholders that are necessary are then notified? Performance management that will facilitate the need to evaluate the behavior of objects for effectiveness and ensuring that equipment is at a acceptable limit based off of our performance requirements. Lastly, are those aspects of security essentials for operating the network, managing it correctly, and protecting assets. This could also be your security management system to ensure that all thresholds of protection and security are then managed and maintained. All right, so let's dive into these a little bit deeper. So again, fault management. When a fault occurs, something happens, it's important that we can respond quickly, rapidly. So determine exactly where the fault is. So let's say we have a system, it goes down because of malware. How are we able to find the infected system? The goal is to be able to find the system, isolate the system, and to perform whichever action is required based off of organizational policies and procedures. If necessary, reconfigure or modify the network in such a way to minimize the impact. Repair or replace failed components. Again, part of this is we have to look at the organization. What are the policies and what are their procedures? As a help desk specialist, we may view getting a system back up and running as the most important role. If we are dealing with incident response, maybe the most important goal is to preserve the system so that we can perform some type of digital evidence collection so we could figure out how the infection actually occurred. So again, be mindful of where your role is and what policies and procedures are within that organization. The fault could be any type of action that has happened. I'm going to grab my pen. So any abnormal condition that's caused the device to be compromised or to fail to perform as required. The fault doesn't have to be malicious. Let's say a server is overheating because of a failed fan. Well, that system component failed to perform, so the fault would need to be repaired. Now, would we have to be mindful of, should we do a digital forensics analysis on the system for a failed fan or for a failed fan? Not necessarily, but again, understand the organizational policies and procedures so you know how to react. That's a big takeaway here. Normally, the fault will indicate a failure of any type of operational component that has either received errors or has done something to flag the system as hindering its normal operations. That ties back into this problem tracking and control. Normally, after a issue has occurred or a fault has occurred, we want to be able to correct the fault and then track it a little bit. Restore system back to full functionality and make sure that the system truly is functional. That means we might have to wait a little bit, check in on the system again, make sure it's still operating normally. I have actually encountered this quite a bit where I might have a system that had malware on the system. I fixed the malware. I then had to wait, a week, check back in on that system to make sure the issue was corrected. And if the issue wasn't correct, then I could escalate and then proceed. Now, if it's, let's say, more dangerous malware, I may not have waited a week. This one was just a malware that was causing a pop-up. And 4 days of clean, and then by the 5th day, the pop-up had occurred. And so by the time I had checked back in, the system was having the pop-up for 3 days. That may or may not be okay based on that organization, but in my situation, it was within the acceptable limits of our policies and procedures. But again, the big thing is problem tracking and control. After you fix a problem, wait, give it time, and then double check to make sure the issue is truly actually repaired. So for fault management, it would be satisfying the maintenance and exam error logs, accepting and clearing out any detection notifications, looking at tracing and identifying the faults, carrying out the appropriate diagnostic tests, and again, corrective faults, and again, corrective updating. As with any other area of network management, fault management should also have minimal effect on the network performance. As we deal with faults and fault management, the network still has to operate correctly. If that is not the case, then there are concerns. If we have to limit how the network is performing to fix something, we may not want to fix it. Implementing certain controls may not always be a good idea. When I'm dealing with network traffic analysis, for example, if I implement a full IPS with scanning, problem is that might drastically impact the network. Some companies are okay with it. Some companies go, no, that will affect our performance too drastically, so we don't want to do it. So we do partial. So, there are considerations to take because of our requirements. So moving past that is our account management. In many enterprises, the ability to manage a system is important, but how is the system being funded? The funding, no one likes to talk about the money. However, the company is a company because they want to make money. They need to be able to turn a profit in most cases. So that means the ability to buy an asset and then have the appropriate parties that use that asset build for that asset is important. So being able to track down who uses what part of the network, who uses what part of the server, or who uses what part of electricity is important. My primary day job is within education. A building in a university is an asset. The room in the building is an asset. The electricity used is an asset. The computers in the room are an asset. The desk is an asset. The chair is an asset. So when we schedule a class, we schedule a room. That room has certain levels of assets. Our department gets billed for use of that asset. Yes, it's all within the budget of the campus. However, the accounting of those assets is important. If my room needs to be upgraded, the college will pay for it, but then again, the upgrade will eventually get charged back to my account for using that room. If different departments use that room, we can now look at how many departments use that room per week, per month, per quarter, per semester, per calendar year, per fiscal year, and that way we can bill accordingly. If my department's the only one using that room, I incur 100% of that cost. If I split it 50-50 with my department and accounting, well, I'm using it half the time, accounting using it half of the time. We now share the cost of that room and assets in that room. That is what account management is all about, is looking at what hardware, what assets, what software, and then being able to bill accordingly. Now, it may be eternal accounting procedures rather than cash, but that is still equally important. In any type of business, this is commonplace. The organization may buy an asset, but who's using the asset typically will pay for that asset in one way or another. Account management also includes informing users of the costs or the resources. So in my example, my department that uses that room, we know the cost of that room. We know the cost of the resources. We know the cost that we're going to incur by using that resource, and we budget it in because the business has to make money, which means we have to budget. We have to know how much assets we're using, how many resources are we consuming. If we look at whiteboards, everyone assumes, oh, well, the whiteboard cleaning service or the whiteboard markers just, get taken out of some random account. No, it is all accounted for. And if we put 8 different departments in a single room, we get billed for it based off of the time we utilize that room. If I use it 20% of the time and some other areas use it 1% of the time, I'm going to pay more for those resources because as we look at the overall structure of billing, I use that resource more than the other groups, so I get billed accordingly. We need to enable account limits so that if you use a room even one day a year, there is a certain threshold that you will be billed. And that basically allows us to schedule the use of those resources. Lastly is enable costs to be combined where multiple resources are invoked. Basically, if I'm using a room, I know that I have the room, I have the whiteboard, I have the physical assets, I have the computer and compute resources. That could be networking, that could be internet, that could be electricity. So we can group certain things in based off of the resources we are using. And then that way we can build out an assignment of scheduling. That's what the account management portion is how do we bill accordingly? It enables costs to be billed correctly. Configuration management, again, is deciding how devices are to be used, how devices are to be configured and managed, and choosing the appropriate hardware and software attributes for the value of that device. If I need a server, am I going to buy a powerful server and use it for a small application? Probably not. I may buy a large server and virtualize my one set of resources and then try to contract other departments for other departments to use that resource so I can share the cost of that server. But I can configure it in such a way to meet my requirements. Configuration management is concerned with the initial configuration, the networking, and is managing and maintenance of that device, including being able to gracefully shut down the services of that system. If I have a server, for example, and I know I have to maintain it and shut it down once a month on Friday, well, who's using it? Is everyone aware that on Friday at that specific given time, we're going to gracefully shut it down so that they're not scheduling work to be done at that time? I actually had an organization that did this where we had a maintenance window the third Friday of every month, and the third Tuesday of every month, they would start a week-long process. Well, they knew on Friday we were shutting it down. So we weren't able to gracefully shut it down because a department was using that system. So what we had to do was we moved that department to a different system so that we could do the maintenance that we needed, and that different department could handle going to a system that was not as controlled within their time constraints for updates. Maintenance, maintaining, adding, updating the components has to be part of the configuration management. How to start up and shut down the operations of the key systems of that item or object. Again, if we know that we are using a certain asset, are we ensuring that when we restart it after an update or we're restarting it after maintenance, that all key components are back to operational status? And sometimes the question is, well, we don't know. So we have to build out the procedures so that we can confirm that that actually is occurring. The thing to understand is that configuration management, it sets the parameters. It sets our controls. That way we can ensure proper maintenance, proper system operations, but it also allows us to build out the routine of that system. That also allows us to associate the objects with names. So if we know we have a server, who is the person in charge of that server? What are the set of managed objects that, or other objects that are required to use that server? What tools are we using to ensure protection of that asset? Who's in charge of that asset? The initial up and down of that object. For example, I just bought a bunch of UPSs. Who's in charge of maintenance? Who's in charge of disposal? Who's in charge of replacing the batteries when they go out? Who's in charge of disposing of the battery, not the actual full unit? And honestly, no one had any idea what we were doing. So when we developed this, we were looking at maintenance, and I had asked, what about battery disposal? And they're like, well, why? Batteries don't last forever. So the ability to start and end the process of an object is important. And that means sometimes building out the appropriate policies and procedures to ensure that asset is correctly configured and protected. Next is data about current objects. And that means collecting information on the demand of that object. If I want to buy a piece of hardware and I'm the only one that's going to use it, normally my organization is going, do we need to buy it? If I can get other people to also want to be able to use it, I'm more likely to use my asset or to be able to purchase my asset. Now, granted, there are conditions. For example, if I have funding for a specific asset or if it's a special use tool, that may be different. Next would be obtain the announcements for changes. So if we have an object, what are the changes and condition to that object? If there are any major changes, it needs to be announced to the appropriate stakeholders. Lastly is the configuration of said object. And there should be some type of change management here. So change management, not just configuration management, but as you are making any change, is there a process? Is there a structure? Are you following the structure? Why does change management matter in configuration management? Because any change that you do might directly affect the system and the performance of that system. As we are looking at performance management, that means we have to look at, well, is there direct impact of performance after a change? If there was there proper change management? Is there a process in place for us to review that change process? So performance management is two broad areas: monitoring and controlling. Monitoring is the function of tracking activities. Controlling is adjustments or tweaks to performance if necessary. The network manager should focus on the initial set of resources, performing monitoring and assessing the performance levels, and then when appropriate, reviewing the performance levels to ensure that proper performance levels are still within the appropriate margin. That means what levels of capability or capacity is okay. What level of capability of use of equipment is okay. What is normal traffic? What is excessive traffic? What is unacceptable levels of traffic? Are there certain bottlenecks? Are there response time issues? Are there VoIP or jitter issues? So if our network is making voice an issue, then we may have to look at that. Are we having jitter issues? Jitter. And that ties directly back to quality of service of certain applications on the network. Anything with real-time traffic. Real-time. Are there any issues? So part of this performance management is ensuring normal operations and reviewing to make sure there are no issues that are occurring. Performance management must monitor the systems, the network, core infrastructure. That way they can provide detailed information about network operations. They can then also provide the details on if there are issues. Because if there are issues, you need to know how to address them. To satisfy the requirements, we're looking at gathering statistical or scientific data. maintain and examine, when appropriate, logs and state histories. That way, if there are concerns, let's say performance is down from last week, we can see what has occurred between our last log and our current log. What happened between before the issue and now dealing with the issue. We can maintain logs so that we can see what changes have occurred. We can also determine system performance under natural conditions versus artificial conditions. Hey, normal traffic looks like A. If the system is infected, it may look like B. If we are using that as a baseline, we can now see, hey, this system is acting kind of strange. Is it acting more like it's baseline or more like it's infected? If it's acting like it's infected, then we know, hey, it's probably infected. So looking at the artificial conditions and understanding what the performance baseline looks like for both natural and artifactual conditions are important. So that would be more like our baseline or our comparison. Those are important. Fourth is altering the system's modes of operations for the purpose of conducting performance. If a system is acting normal one way, if the system can act, let's say it has an active mode. If we activate the active mode, does that impact performance? What do our baselines look like when things are one mode versus another? For example, my system, I have automatic smart overclocking disabled. I've noticed that when it's disabled, I get one performance level. When it's enabled, I get a different performance level. All that means by system modes is looking at the different operational state modes and see if there are differences in performance. That will allow you to gauge how you're supposed to monitor those events. So why does all of this matter? All of this matters because it's about being able to maintain the operational status of the network, mainly so that the business can operate. One of the things that people don't realize is IT is there to make sure the business can keep doing what the business does, which is being in business. Both sides have to work together. IT, security, and the business side of the organization all have to align. And so in previous chapters, when we were talking about business alignment, that's a huge concept that a lot of companies are still not quite getting all the way through. All right, so moving forward, we have our security management. This is concerned with encryption or protection, dealing with the protection of data and the information of the organization, monitoring and access. This is also dealing with collecting and storing audit records, also providing the facilities for protecting resources and end users, and is the purpose for looking at application security and policies. They normally fall into the three main categories: administrative controls, technical or logical controls, and physical controls. The administrative controls are policies and procedures. All of this is to ensure security management can actually happen. This is so that you can protect the integrity of the organization. You can protect the data, protect the people, protect the resources of the organization. Here we have network management system. So it's, again, a collection tool consisting of hardware and software of existing components, and it's designed to view the entire network as a unified architecture. I like to think of it more of a networking dashboard where you can see all of the details of the organization. So it's a single operating interface with a powerful but user-friendly set of commands to perform certain actions. These are just a monitoring dashboard for network operations centers, NOCs, to be able to manage the network. It might look something like combining all of the key systems. So the element of a network management system is going to be the network, the workstations, the hardware devices, the servers, all key technology into a centralized dashboard. That way you can see what's going on. Here we have things like the operating system of the managers or the workstations or the communications portion of network infrastructure. All of this is to collect data so you can have a realistic view of what's happening on the network from a centralized point of view. A huge part of the MNE, the network management entities, is to collect data on the communication and network activities, on the systems resource activities, on the hardware activities, the hardware load, to store the statistics, to be able to respond to commands. So let's say, for example, we see a server is flooding the network. We should be able to monitor that server and then prevent that server from flooding the network. That might be a stop command or maybe a clear communication command so that it temporarily stops sending communication. But essentially the goal here is to control the hardware and software. So to control the software portion, we have a network management application in MA, and this will include the operator interface to allow authorized users to manage the network. So MNA might be your primary workstation. That's going to be where the dashboard is. That's going to be the component that is centralizing everything. Here is more of a traditional distributed network management configuration between multiple locations. We have a central site, we have a few branch sites, we have an internet connection. So this is just a much more top-level view of what the network management configuration could be. A big takeaway with this is in a traditional network management system is there's one central area. In a distributed area, you might have multiple management stations distributed throughout the entire organization. Again, it really just depends from how your organization is structured and set up. You could also have a third party that centralizes the network management and monitoring portion that might not even be attached to your main network. It might be a cloud-based service or other based services. So here is our management system, the logical flow. We're going to have a service management layer. We're going to have a network management layer. We're going to have an enterprise communication standard. So I'm going to grab my pen again. So this is where base connection is going to happen. So this is going to be the networking structure. We have our element management layers. That's going to be, again, our security, our configuration, our fault management. That's going to be that element management layer. That layer is going to interact with the top additional layers, network management and service management. And that is where most of the networking and IT staff are going to be. IT and management staff. That's going to be our troubleshooting tickets, our knowledge base. All right, so let's keep going. So again, our troubleshooting, our database, our knowledge-based systems are going to be there. Don't like when it does that. But again, this is where the management of certain services are going to be. Down here is the managers. It's going to be more of the staff. And then again, our defer is going to happen here. Our inventory is going to happen here. So again, they kind of break these up into networking and services. And that includes automation. Automation is going to be part of the services to kind of help minimize the load on the network management and help desk series. All right, so let's jump into some hardware. Let's talk about some infrastructure components. So here we have a firewall. A firewall is just that. It is a wall that prevents things from coming in. We can have either a host-based or a network-based firewall. And you can also have a combination thereof. So here we're looking at host-based security. That could be a firewall on an individual system. We could also have a network-based firewall that could be on the edge of our network facing our internet connection. Both could be there. Same thing with IDSs and IPSs. We could have host-based and network-based. Again, the question we have to ask ourselves is, where is that device being located? That tells us if it's host-based or network-based. And there can be a combination of both. Typically, a firewall is, again, between the perimeter network and the internet. That allows the flow of communication to flow through that firewall to maintain a certain level of security. You can also deploy internal firewalls between multiple segment portions of a network. Let's say we have a credit card network and we have an SAN network. Well, we may want to separate them with a firewall. And you need to be able to look at how they are being deployed. So you can have separate internal firewalls depending on what type of information is you're needing to be protected. A firewall will provide the additional layers of defense and protection, insulating the different networks if necessary. This does follow the classical military doctrine, defense in depth. Basically, your goal here is to have multiple layers of protection so that if one layer is affected, you can still grow, you can still be agile, and an attacker, if they only get through one layer, there's still multiple layers to get through, so the business is still able to function. An interesting note is there's multiple types of firewalls, not just host-based and network-based, but even within a host-based firewall, there's multiple types, or a network-based firewall, again, multiple types. So here are a few characteristics. The firewall listens for the following design goals. Traffic from the inside to the outside, vice versa, if they have to pass through the firewall. Do we have to track the conversations to and from? Authorized traffic as defined by security policies, or the firewall itself is immune to penetration. These are all really interesting things. What gets interesting with this is, I'm going to grab my pen again. We might have a firewall, and we can say no TCP port 80. However, if a PC on the inside actually requests web-based traffic, and it leaves, and it comes back in, and it's port 80, because it was actually originally initiated on the inside, it might be allowed back in. That is a type of firewall. So it track the state of communication. And that is actually really important when we are looking at firewalls. We can also look at the controls. There are four main techniques for access and enforcement. Service control, that's determining the type of internet service that can be accessed. The firewall will filter traffic based off of IP address, protocols, port numbers, and provide typically a proxy server. Directional control, that will determine the direction in which the particular service requests are initiated and allowed to go through the firewall. We also have user control, and that's where the user access the service according to the type of user. Not all users are coded the same, so certain users may be coded to allow certain access where other users are not. This feature is typically applied to users inside a firewall perimeter, a local user, and can be applied to incoming traffic for external users based off of source destination addressing, IPsec, other VPN technologies, account authentication and authorization services. So there's a lot of things that are here. Lastly would be the behavioral component, and this is the control how particular services are then used. So let's look at the capacity. So the capabilities within the scope of a firewall, again, a firewall does provide that single choke point. Firewalls provide a location for monitoring. It does a centralized device. A firewall is a convenient platform for a lot of the security features that could be grouped together. A firewall does serve as a platform for implementing other security tools like a VPN or SIM or IDS and IPSs, or maybe anti-spam or virus checking. So I mean, there are things here. The big thing is the single choke point, which means all traffic will have to flow through that. So some of the limitations are the firewall typically can't protect against attacks by attackers bypassing the firewall. Firewall does not fully protect against internal-based threats based off of the location. An improperly secured wireless network can allow for bypassing of the network traffic. Also, people bringing in mobile devices to the network, well, bypasses the firewall protections altogether. So firewalls aren't the end-all be-all. You normally place them. So let's say we have a cloud, we have our router and a firewall, and that feeds into our network. Well, if someone plugs into the network, it's already on the inside of the network. So the firewall router slash isn't going to prevent it. It isn't going to do anything about it unless the traffic leaves the network and then comes back into the network. Or there might be a control for data leaving the network that might see BS type data or damage type data, then the firewall might prevent it. But if someone's able to gain local access to the LAN, I'm going to draw that again. PC1 and PC2. If someone is able to plug into the local network, firewall isn't going to provide protection because the firewall at this location is on the edge of the network. Could each PC have a host-based firewall? Yes, we could have a host firewall as part of the operating system of the individual hosts. That does mean an additional layer of protection, but that also means an additional layer for a systems administrator to have to manage. But is it worth it? That's part of the up to the individual organization about what they believe is acceptable and what they think is not acceptable. Here we have our types of firewalls: packet filtering versus stateful inspection. These are two big ones. Packet filtering operates as a positive filter, allowing only packets that meet specific criteria, or a negative filter, basically rejecting anything that doesn't meet certain criteria. Depending on the type of firewall, you can examine one or more protocol headers to determine which one you're doing. Packet filtering firewalls applies a set of rules to each incoming and outgoing packet, and then forwards or discards based accordingly. The type of firewall is typically configured to filter packets going both inside or outside. Filtering rules are based off of information contained in the IP packet header. It could be source and destination IP, or within the segment, so source to destination transport. It could also be looking at the protocol or the interface. The packet filtering is typically set up as a list of rules based on matching the fields of either the layer 3 or layer 4 header information. The default action typically is discard. This is not excessively permitted or prohibited, or the default action could be set to forwarding, which is basically allow everything. Often, most current modern day firewalls are default set to discard. The default policy of discard is more conservative of the two, but that does mean it's going to block everything that's not inherently allowed. One actually will allow for the state information. So that is actually a huge part of this. The stateful inspection maintains a state of all the packets, meaning things that are blocked based off of TCP port 80, for example, might actually be allowed in if it was initiated on the inside. All right, so let's look at some examples. Here we have a pretty common example of a filtering set of rules. So again, the order does matter, first of all. So let me grab my pen. So I'm assuming these are all different sets of rules. There is an inherent deny at the very end. So first of all, if we are looking at rule set A, that's the top one. So this is, and just the photo got cut off. Block everything. So source, so any source, any destination going to SIGOT on any port. So for whatever reason, they don't get trusted. So it's going to block everything going to that specific host on any port. We're going to allow our default gateway off of port 25 going anywhere. And then there's an inherent deny. So it's rule set A basically is very restrictive. We say that nothing can happen other than our gateway going to port 25 to anywhere. So that may not be the best option. Rule set B, allow anything going on any port going to any host on port 25. Rule set 23, allow our host with any port going to any port going to port 25 with no identified flags. That means we can at least send data anywhere to the SMTP non-secure port. We can also send anything on port 25 to any destination with any port, allowing for an acknowledgement of the original connection. So some of these are a little bit more less making sense, like set D, allow for everything, and then allow everything including the reply back, and then allow everything where port number is greater than 1023. Again, these just aren't super realistic. The block everything would mean no network traffic leaving those interfaces that this is applied to. So again, not all of these are going to make the most sense when we're dealing with certain protocols or situations. Oftentimes, when I'm looking at packet filtering, I'm looking at what rules do I need to create and what impact that creation of those rules are going to occur. So let's look at why packet filtering might be a better option. So advantage of packet filtering firewalls is it's more simplistic. Filtering is very transparent. However, packet filtering allows for a lot of weaknesses. Filtering do not examine upper layer data. Limitations include limited information for logging. Most packet filtering firewalls don't support advanced user authentication. That's not always, but often. Filtering firewalls are generally vulnerable to attacks and exploits that take advantage of problems within TCP/IP. Packet filtering firewalls are susceptible to security breaches caused by improper configuration. Realistically, everything is vulnerable to improper configuration. Packet filtering firewall attacks can be IP spoofing, routing attacks, or fragment attacks. So it really just depends on the type of protection for your organization. I'm not going to cover the detailed different types of attacks. You guys are smart enough to do the additional research, but understand that packet filtering firewalls are not the most safest. They are better than nothing, but there are definitely some concerns. Here we have a stateful firewall connection state table, and it says what source port is connecting to what destination. So these are established connections, meaning the stateful firewall will actually build out a table of what devices are connecting. That way, if a response comes back from a destination IP address that matches one of these records, it knows to allow that connection in. And you can either allow the established connection component, or you can still say block it. It really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. That connection state ability table is actually really important when we're dealing with our security aspect of filtering, because you can have very specific controls that say block port 443 from coming in unless it's initiated on the inside. That concept is actually really important to understand, that established connection state. All right, moving on, we have things like application firewalls and application level gateways. They act as an application level for traffic, like they filter traffic. They are more secure than packet filtering. The prime disadvantage of this type of gateway is the processing ability. It needs a lot more processing ability. Application level gateway can look at higher level data, and that means that traffic then has to be analyzed and reviewed. There's also a circuit level gateway. This is the fourth type of firewall, is the circuit level proxy. It is either a standalone system or a specialized function performed by an application level gateway for certain based applications. As with any application gateway, this doesn't permit end-to-end connection. Rather, the gateway sets up two-way connection, one between itself and one between the user on the innermost host. So essentially, we're used to end-to-end connectivity. With it will set up between source and destination. It will have a session here and a session here. Instead of the traditional, this is my source IP, this is my destination IP, and it actually building a session state with the from the source to the destination. Our circuit level gateway establishes a session here and then establishes a new session between itself and the destination. This is a typical use case for this, a situation where the system administrator trusts the internal users, but these get a little weird. They act more like a proxy, if anything else. We also have next generation firewalls, and these are just modern day firewalls. They have additional features and functions that are now commonplace. They are implemented either software or hardware, and they're capable of filtering, and they're also capable of having additional features like proxies, IDSs, IPSs, and so much more. The common functionality is there. The next generation firewall are more capable. They typically have faster processing, and such firewalls do a full packet inspection if programmed to do so, and they look at signatures of payloads of packets or other anomalies to detect malware, again assuming that you have this feature turned on and configured. Next generation firewalls also have geo IP addressing, meaning you can say block all IP addresses from Russia, and instead of having to build out a firewall list, it's one of the features that you can now just say Russia, and the firewall blocks all known IP addresses coming out of Russia or whatever country that you're selecting. Here is an example of a firewall configuration. We have a boundary router, and in reality, these two devices could be a router with firewall functionality. So it might be both. They don't have to be logically separated. It could be one. Here we have a router. Then we're going to have, this is always another fun one, another router that won't be a LAN switch. If this is a DMZ, this is going to be a router. And then after that, it might be another router firewall or a firewall interface before it gets to the LAN part of the network. This right here is going to be a separate network. So when whoever designed this did a little bit of an oopsie, because this is not going to share an IP address. It's not going to share an IP address scope. So it's saying that that's how it's going to be. That's not realistic. This being a separate network is more realistic. That's why I said not a LAN switch, but another router. That way this can be its own IP scope, and the LAN can be its own IP scope. That way they are kept separate. All right, moving on, we have our virtual private networks, or VPNs. A VPN is a private network through an additional network, normally done through tunneling. The tunneling normally is encrypted, but doesn't have to be encrypted. There are two main modes of VPNs, a mobile type VPN or a site-to-site VPN. Traffic designated for VPN traffic goes from the VPN source to the destination of that VPN. So let's draw this out. So VPNs might be a tunnel between two locations. That's a site-to-site VPN. That way, there are two dedicated points that allow for the tunneling between a network. That could be through a public network, that could be through the internet, it could be through many ways. A mobile VPN is a router with a static IP, and then you have mobile clients coming in to connect. The mobile clients can be anywhere. They could be at a Starbucks. They could be flying. They could be across the world. These different connections all call back to the router with a static IP address. That way, those workers can work remotely. This allows us to ensure workers can do their job. Now, typically, a mobile worker connecting via VPN is secure. There are protocols out there to ensure a base level of protection. A common mobile VPN technology is IPsec, or IP security. It is a set of standards for all versions of IP to build in with security features. The principal feature of IPsec is that it encrypts and authenticates all traffic at layer 3. It distributes applications, including remote logon, client-server connection, and other things, to be secure. There are some areas for IPsec that you need to understand. There is the authentication only feature, and that refers to the authentication header only, and that would be classified as AH. So if you're programming a VPN, it's going to say, if you're using IPsec, do you want AH or ESP? Oftentimes, ESP is what you want. AH only deals with the authentication header, where ESP, or encapsulating security payload, combines the authentication and encryption functionality. ESP is what you want. IPsec also has a very specific key structure, and that is normally known as IKE. And we're going to get more into the VPN technology a little bit later, but now, for the basic level of understanding for IPsec, is understanding you have to look at the payload options, either AH or ESP, and then about the key exchange. How can we ensure phase 1 and phase 2 of VPN are actually set securely? And that is done through a key exchange through IKE. And I did say phase 1 and phase 2 because there are two phases of a VPN. Phase 1 is the initial key exchange, verifying, and then it builds a tunnel, and that's part of phase 2. And that will ensure that a tunnel is actually kept secure. So let's look at how this is done. So this is one of the types of modes for IPsec. This is our tunneling mode. And essentially, for the authentication, it looks at the entire header. Then we have an encrypted part that encrypts the original header so that only part of it is protected. So when we look at the diagram, let me grab my pen. So this IP traffic is protected via IPsec, and so is this, and so is this. So going through a public network is encrypted. Once it hits a router or firewall on our edges, that will then remove the new header, and it will look at the original header and payload and then process accordingly. That allows us to have tunnels through the main public network. And then once they actually get to the branch locations and the new information is removed, then it goes back to unprotected traffic as part of normal data traffic. So in these areas, this is classified as part of the LAN. That would be unencrypted, normally protected traffic. Here is a VPN scenario. You have users all over a network. So if we're using IPsec, for example, you'd have your IP header. That would then be secured with IPsec header. And you might have a secure payload that is sent through a public network. And from there, it would go to the destinations. It would hit the destinations, firewalls or edge devices, and it would strip off the protected secured header. And then at that point, it will process the IP packet as normal. Here is a TN 942 compliant data show for functional areas. So again, here we have our carriers. Here we have our demarcation room or our geolocation mark. We have a customer side or customer's edge. So this right here, this entrance room is a provider's edge. And at the demarcation point is the customer's edge. And if you ever do any work with ISPs, that PE versus CE is where they do that. The customer's edge is the responsibility of the customer. At the point of the demarcation point, where that is the single point where the provider's edge will meet the customer's edge. The provider is responsible for everything up until that point. The customer's edge is from that point onward into the company. From there, we might have a main distribution area. Could be a data center, could be a rack of equipment, could be a core router, could be lots of different things. From there, it might be distributed to other distribution areas. Could be a IDF or MDF. It could be other data centers. It could be other areas within that organization. It really just depends on that organization. So I said something very specific. I said IDF and MDF. So this main area would be the main distribution center or main DF. So the distribution frame. From here, that's the main point. All of the other locations would be called IDFs or interconnecting areas. The big part here is understand that there is one main and there are many IDFs. That could be your data closets. But if we're using specific words, the customer edge will connect to the main distribution center. The main distribution center will then connect to the interconnecting distribution centers, and that would be called the IDFs. So network device configuration, a huge part of this is following best practices. Principal security objectives related to the network configuration is to ensure configuration of the network devices are done properly. Network devices have to be accurate and does not compromise the security of the organization. There are policies and procedures, and my favorite, best practices, and CIS controls for ensuring the hardening of those appliances. That means looking at device configuration, vulnerabilities, change management, reviewing and auditing, the standards for best practices and other principles, and restricting access following the appropriate CIS controls. SAN has what's called the SANS 20 or the CIS 20. These are guidelines, 20 main guidelines for ensuring the protection of an organization. It walks you through how to harden just about anything. That way, you can ensure a base level configuration of your different components. You have a server that you want to bring online, or a new switch you want to bring online. You can look at the SANS 20 and you can determine the appropriate controls for ensuring protection and security. So I understand we really haven't talked about networking all that much, so here's the networking aspect. 3 areas of physical networking that have to be mentioned. There's the actual cabling, whether that be copper, whether that be fiber optic, whether that be wireless. We have to have our access points, and that's typically going to mean the points of gaining access to a network. That could include our routers, our switches, our network interface cards, or our NICs. We could also have our wireless access points that will connect to our physical network that allows for the wireless devices to then connect. We also have the documentation portion of the networking, and that is our physical and logical topology maps, meaning we're going to be having the documentation of our network. That, again, the physical layout of wiring, ports, locations, and our logical might be our VLAN data and other components. Here we have our tier system design for data centers, as defined by TIA 942. Tier 1 is susceptible to disruption for both planned and unplanned activity. The availability key for Tier 1 should be 99.671 or totaling 28.8 hours total out of the year. Tier 2 is less susceptible, is 99.741 or 22 hours out of the year. Tier 3 is looking at 99.982. That's 1.6 hours out of the year. Tier 4 is 99.995 or 0.4 hours for the year. Planned activities, not disruptions. Multiple activity, power, cooling, data paths. And Tier 4 takes a while. That's going to be left up to key infrastructure. Things that are less important might be Tier 3, but again, still important, but not as important. That 99.982 is going to be a huge press for that. Servers and routers and switches are probably going to be in the Tier 3 and 4. Things that can have more outage, 22 hours a year, or that 99.741, that's going to be less likely to have dual power, things of that nature. The big takeaway here is understanding the tier portion as it relates to reliability. The standards define the 4 major tiers of protection and timing availability. If you want 99.995, you're going to be paying for it, and you have to understand what normally is going to go in those categories. External network connections, meaning how are you connecting your current network to an external network? The biggest one is going to be the internet. What are the policies? What are the procedures? How are you limiting and restricting access? Are there policies for firewall? Are there policies for encrypted devices? Are there policies for VPNs? So you need to ensure that there are the appropriate administrative and logical/technical controls in place to ensure the guidelines for protection of your assets as they connect through a external network connection. Basically, the goal here is to prevent unauthorized external users from gaining access, but also from allowing internal users to send unauthorized information outside the network. We have firewall policies outlining by NIST 841, Guidelines on Firewalls and Firewall Policies. Basically, they give you the structure of how to set up your firewall correctly, based on organization firewall policies on comprehensive risk analysis, which would be your NIST 853. And notice how they map back and forth the different NIST standards to ensure protection. They are also mapping to the CIS 20 standards, also known as the SAN 20 standards. For the firewall implementation, there are 5 stages: plan, configure, test, deploy, manage. Plan is the first phase, involves identifying all the requirements. Configuration is the second phase, involves all facets of configuring the hardware platform. Testing is the third phase, and that ensures implementation and testing of a prototype design, reviewing, configuring, double checking, identifying any issues, addressing those issues before going to stage 4, which is deploying. And that is after testing is completed and all issues resolved, deploying is putting it into a real environment. Managing is what happens after you deploy it, and that's the maintaining it through the life cycle. And when change management does occur, having to update as necessary. After that, we can talk about remote maintenance. Because guess what? If you have assets, you have to be able to maintain them. Maintenance are basically activities conducted by individuals who are external to the security team that involves maintaining and patching and keeping things up to date and working. It's a convergence to the enterprise. I mean, they're part of the enterprise. In some environments, it's also necessary that IoT or industrial IoT are also put into maintenance, and that means the ability to remotely maintain them. I take care of several plants across the United States where I log in and I maintain the industrial control systems for a drywall plant. And essentially for that, I log in and I ensure that those sensors and control units are updated and working properly. And if they're not working properly, I report it to the appropriate authority, and then they send out someone on site, if necessary, to see what's going on. The principal security objective in this area is to prevent unauthorized access to critical components to a facility, but also being able to keep up remote maintenance for those facilities. When we're talking industrial or IoT-based units, only having the authorized individual maintain and access those devices. Remote maintenance also is dealing with authorization, monitoring, and controlling of sensors or control units remotely, allowing the use of remote maintenance for diagnostic tool purposes or diagnostic issues. For one of my clients, we actually were called out because the control unit had recognized that a faulty hardware was starting to occur, so we got an alert saying we need to replace that hardware. So the controller unit itself let us know, go do this. Maintenance records for our devices, including diagnostical logs, terminate all the appropriate sessions correctly and logging it. That way an attacker may not be able to piggyback on an already approved session. Normally passwords when appropriate. Audit always. Document always. Audit so that you can ensure only those with access are the ones accessing it, and again ensuring that a certain level of base security are always there. That is huge, that a lot of companies don't want to do, but the audit and the documentation is critical to ensure a certain base level of protection and security. Other controls might also be things like requiring the remote maintenance to be performed off of a specific IP address and allowed base list, requiring remote sensors to be protected by strong authenticators, including multi-factor authentication. And again, not always happening, but these are all techniques that should be in place. Require the designated organization official to have specific approval for maintenance, implement cryptography and encryption, and employ remote disconnect verification and termination of the diagnostic sessions. So you can actually have systems that let you know, hey, you've initiated a connection, you get an alert. When you disconnect fully, you get an alert. That way, those that are responsible know when connections are being made and when they're being terminated. That way, if you're auditing, hey, who's doing what when, if you see someone connecting to a remote sensor at midnight, you can be like, that's not normal. And then you could then plan accordingly to ensure that doesn't happen again, or you can start an investigation or whatever that policy may be for that organization. Here we have functional modules for standard protocols for use between a mail authenticator. We are jumping all over the place with this chapter. So mail authenticators, specifically email, when you set up a email, you have a user, you type an email, you are a message user agent. You will submit an email to a message submission agent, MSA. That message submission agent will send it to a mail transfer agent, MTA, and they'll be using SMTP to send the data from your email provider to the destination email provider, in which the destination email provider will get it from their MTA, which will send it to their mail delivery agent, MDA, which will send it to a mail storage area until the mail user agent receives it, or the message user agent receives it. That's the general flow for email. I never really had to know that for certification or a testing, but it's just understanding the mail flow is kind of important. Understand that you will send it to a submessage agent, and a transfer agent is what actually sends it between your client and the destination client. And the destination client will have a delivery agent that delivers it to the appropriate recipient. And the fun part with that is there are certain trustworthiness components for email-based standards. There are a lot of number of threats to email. Oftentimes, cloud-based email are also susceptible to attacks. So how do we ensure a certain level of protection? Is understand threats and how to classify them. Email threats could be authentication-related threats, integrity-related threats, confidentiality-related threats, or availability-related threats. Authentication can be resulting in the unauthorized access to an employee's email. Integrity could result in unauthorized modification in transit. Confidentiality could result in unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. And availability would prevent end users from being able to send or receive said email. There's also policies, other administrative controls like policies for acceptable use. You'll have an acceptable use for behavior as well as unacceptable use. And oftentimes you are assuming that what is allowed will be the acceptable use, and anything not explicitly stated in the acceptable use of email would then be disallowed. This is really important. So when you're dealing with any organization, whether it's email or any technology-based assets, read the acceptable use policy. Understand what it says. Not what people say it says, but read it yourself. Oftentimes, I have seen organizations assume policies say one thing and they act like the policies say that thing. I've actually had a number of times where I knew what the policy said and it covered my butt. I've been able to go, the policy doesn't say that, it actually says this. And most people never read the policy, so they don't know. So read the acceptable use policy so you understand what it says. Oftentimes, there's a monitoring, sanctions, and agreement section The monitoring is just letting you know it's a business tool and the business is going to monitor it. There are sanctions for those that fail to comply, and then there are the initial agreement to use that asset. Again, make sure you know what you are agreeing to. Make sure you know what the rules are. It will only be in your benefit to understand the rules, so that if someone says, oh, well, you violated this rule by you did that, if you know what the rules actually say, you can be like, well, no, I didn't violate the rule. The rule says this, and your interpretation may have made it seem like that, but the rule actually says ABC. I've actually been able to stop a number of people by being able to quote the rules back to them. And that covers my butt. So make sure you understand that. And that does not apply to just email. Understand the acceptable use policy for all technology-based assets. Email, what websites you can view, all of that. I've actually been terminated from a job because of an email policy. I was on vacation and IT logged into my computer, reset the password, and then checked a personal email. That, without looking further in depth, it showed my account, checked personal email, I was terminated. I actually grieved it, did a grievance against it, and it turned out an IT person reset my account via audit logs. This was found out. The IT person then proceeded to log into my account as me after they reset my password, and then checked their own personal email. Well, I grieved it. I was given a wrongful termination, and I was actually compensated because of the wrongful termination. I wasn't granted my employment back because the contract was actually over by the time we took them to court, but I did actually receive payment because of it. So understanding the rules, especially the acceptable use policies, really help protect you. So other security policies for emails are outlined by national standards like the ISO 27001, and that's the code of practice for controls that will be protecting messages, ensuring correctness of the transportation and encryption, ensuring reliability, legal factors, that's a big one. You want to make sure your general counsel is involved with your email components. Oftentimes, companies don't realize the legality of email, and so general counsel is never part of this. As I consult with a lot of organizations, I normally bring up general counsel needs to have a message or at least a foot in the door when we're talking about email, because there are plenty of components where their input is drastically needed. Obtaining approval for public services like IM or social media from the perspective of the individual user, specifying strong level of authentication when accessing records, when accessing email over a public record. I have one job where I actually cannot access my email through the internet. I have to do a VPN tunnel, and then I can log into the email system. That's because in their mind, they don't want to have any form of protection for that email system on the public internet. They'd rather just me VPN in and then check my email. Always consider legal factors. What are the requirements that are necessary? Can you disclose things via email? Is there email encryption? Do your staff know how to use email encryption? Those are all really important things because we often assume that's there and they're really not set up, or they're not set up correctly. Instant messaging, it could be through an instant messenger application on your computer or through a phone, through Teams or through Google Hangouts or plenty of other things. These are basically text messages or media messages sent using one of these areas. Understand the rules on how to use IMs. I've been part of an investigation where we fired several workers for improper use of instant messaging. They actually were going back and forth privately talking between two workers, but it was hate speech. And the organization had a rule against hate speech. Someone seen one of the IMs, and this cascaded into a giant event, but it was a company-owned IM, it was a company-owned computer, so the workers were actually fired because of the speech they were putting in the IMs. So again, understand the rules, acceptable use policies for IMs. And that also means personal use of IMs, compliance requirements. My favorite actually is the confidentiality of those IMs. If you state them, but it's on a work platform, who owns it? Is the company owning it? Is the company responsible? Are you, the user, using it responsible? To what level are you responsible? What level is the company responsible? Understand the acceptable use policies for instant messaging solutions. And that includes, more on the administrative side, the support for IMs, the policies or the administrative controls, and are there controls in place for file sharing? I actually use Teams quite a bit. For one company, there is no file sharing using IMs. For another company, they have no problem with it. So again, understanding your individual organization's policies and procedures is kind of important. Security policies for IMs. Are there threats for IMing? Yes. That is because IMs are typically very poorly implemented and there's very little oversight to them. So IM-based attacks are very, very, very common. So if you're going to employ them, you have to have security policies to protect them. Microsoft Teams is a very common platform used, or Slack or Discord. There needs to be policies built out to ensure protection. There are basic approaches for enabling security for instant messaging. One approach is host an enterprise IM server to home, or the enterprise might also opt for a cloud-based solution. Microsoft Teams is a great example of a cloud-based system. We use Teams, which is belonging to the Microsoft realm, and that's cloud-based. Discord could be an in-house server that is being used. Both have pros and cons, but you need to understand which is best for your organization. Voice over IP, phone-based systems are growing in popularity. Are you doing a phone system in-house, or are you third-party systems? Oftentimes, organizations don't realize how simple voice over IP is and the advantages that you have. However, you do need to have someone that's capable of setting it up. So oftentimes this is a third-party based system. A giant red flag with voice over IP systems are third-party managed systems that aren't audited. I have actually come across this a number of times because VoIP systems are typically cheaper. Companies will use a third party to host them, but the third party won't manage them, won't patch them, won't secure them. And you may pay for the third party to host it, but is managing and maintenance in the contract. I had one company flat out get compromised because of their voice over IP system, and the VoIP server hosting company was like, well, it wasn't our responsibility to approve the updates. You guys never told us to update it, so we never updated it. And the voice over IP server sat on the internet on the company's premise for 5 years, never updated. When we did a risk assessment, we found there were 30 Chinese companies relating all of their voice traffic through this phone server. The company was a medium-based casino, and it turned out the casino had been paying like $2,000 a month for years for phone-based services. And in reality, the casino was using $20. The Chinese companies were using $1,980 worth of phone traffic, but the company just never wanted to deal with it, so they just let it happen. When we alerted them to a compromised server, the amount of BS that just spiraled from there. But the big takeaway from that is, if you're doing voice over IP, audit, maintenance, verify, and regularly verify the protection and security of said system. VoIP programming typically is going to be a phone server connecting via a data compression for packetization, using the RTP protocol. That will go to UDP, that will be translated back to IP, and then transmitted over a network. You need to have a PBX for phone traffic. A traditional PBX with a traditional analog phone system will work. That allows you to have voice. However, if you want voice over IP, you need to have a digital or voice PBX. We still call it a PBX because that's the traditional phone system that's used. But the big thing is our voice will be real-time traffic using the RTP protocol sent via UDP over IP. Your voice over IP could have a actual computer, could have a workstation, could have a soft phone where it's an application-based phone. It really just depends. And it will connect to a public switch telephone network where traditional phone systems will connect. And that actually provides us a trunk. So actually, So this is a trunk between our voice over IP system and our traditional plain old telephone system. You could have a hardware phone. You could have a soft phone on a computer. You could have a conference phone, which would still be a hardware device. So it really just depends. The big thing is the connection between a VoIP network and a public network or a traditional phone network. We connect via a trunk. That's a huge thing. And then you typically have some type of phone number, also known as a DID, that identifies where to route the phone call. All of this goes back to an analog phone system. Your phone number is attached to the plain old telephone system's network. That will actually allow you to say, if you call this number, forward to this IP address, this phone server. So, some of the context. We have to have an IP PBX. We have to have a media gateway that controls the connectivity of those devices. Threats. This is a good one. If you do not harden your phone server and you make it publicly accessible, there are things on the internet combing just to take over a phone server. For a research project, we brought a brand new free PBX server on the internet, and it was taken over in less than a minute. Calls were already being routed through it. So understand that your IP PBX needs to be secure before you put it on the network. VoIP traffic that travels through the internet can be hacked. You want to make sure it's protected. Older firewalls and older equipment might cause jitter. That's going to be like the robotic voice traffic. Phones inherit the security flaws of the operating systems they use. Not all IP phones are created equal. Some are better than others. Systems used out of the box have default passwords and use default ports. Again, you want to make sure you're following your appropriate hardening techniques. Hardening is important. Hardening and your assessments. Both vulnerability and risk have to be there. Vulnerability for VoIP, I think, is probably the more important one because they will find things like default passwords. And so you can address them quicker. But you still need to do a risk assessment of your devices as you put them on the network. Also, because this is a real-time component, denial of service or availability-based attacks are pretty common against them. You can also now have spam over internet-based phone calls. So when you're like, well, I got a phone number from myself. How does that happen? That's spam over internet calls. Or you could have just a voice over IP send out data as if they were a different phone number. And those are pretty common now. Eavesdropping on voice over IP for people that are able to intercept the data packets happen. Man in the middle definitely can happen. There are ways to mitigate them, but that does mean you actually have to deploy them correctly. So security measures. Encryption, number 1. Maintenance is always a key thing here. Keep the maintenance on your devices current and correct, and test them. Vulnerability assessments, check them. VPNs when appropriate. Have a real-time antivirus scanner. Understand that might affect the quality of service or the class of service of your devices. But if you are worried about viruses coming in via a real-time traffic, you're going to have to do that. Application-based firewalls on your IP PBX. Authentication. Ensure default passwords are modified and corrected. User authentication. That's another big one. Again, make sure default passwords are changed. Make sure user passwords are appropriate. Follow company policies, but use common sense. Guess what? There's also best practices for implementing voice over IP. Follow them. And they're there for a reason, because oftentimes we don't view our voice server as important. But if it's on the network and it's publicly accessible, guess what? You need to make sure you're doing proper maintenance and protection of said server. I say that because I deal with a lot of clients that ignore phone systems and it just causes nothing but damage. So telephones and conferences, guess what? The security objective with respect to telephone conferences is preventing unauthorized users. You can implement a voice over IP system with conference tools. You can have cloud-based conference tools. Basically, have the appropriate controls, both logical and physical. So in this area, logical and physical controls to ensure protection of said voice systems. There are recommendations that should be applied if you're using phone systems. Again, follow best practices. Register and authenticate your users. Protect voicemails. Remove default passwords. Follow best practices. I cannot reiterate that enough. At the end of everything, follow best practices. That is going to be your best protection. For network management, we looked at device configuration, network management, wireless access, firewalls. Again, follow best practices. That is the key takeaway from this lecture. When we're dealing with communication, look at best practices. There are plenty of organizations. There are NIST standards. There are ISO standards. There are IA and TIA standards. There are IA standards and TIA standards and IA-TIA standards. There are the ITU standards. There are standards out there that, there's also SAN standards that outline how to protect your network, your communications, your phones. Use them. All right, that is all for this chapter. Thank you. So this concludes our lecture review on this book. Questions, concerns, or thoughts, leave a comment, make a statement, get a hold of me. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Remember that when we do some of this, it is critical that we ensure that we're answering your questions. Don't just listen and don't try to apply. Listen, try to apply what we've been discussing, and when possible, if you're not understanding something, say something.